Hi, welcome back. We are on the third video of the History of Philosophy timeline. And if you recall, we're talking about the logical options or the logos of history. We looked at reason is ontological and there is no God. We looked at reason is ontological and God exists. We looked at reason is not ontological and God exists. Now we're going to be focusing in on reason is not ontological and God does not exist. Reason cannot grasp the nature of reality. Reason cannot grasp human nature, and there is no God. We're almost back to these first philosophers in some sense, except they really were thinking we could know the world was possible. But now we're into a kind of radical empiricism, and it's going to turn out to be radical skepticism. And what does that do for ethics if we can't know human nature? So I will show you some of the trends. So I mentioned Nietzsche in the last video. I want to use him as a transition to the next period. So Nietzsche is known as a vitalist. He thought the good life was the pursuit of life itself, vitality. He was more of an individualist than a collectivist, but if you think about the problem there, everyone is looking for a rich, vital life, pursuing their desires. There will be conflict because he also has this idea that everything is the clash of power. And he has this theory of the will to power. You will what you desire and you go and get it. And this could lead to force, you know? And so a piece of history is that the Nazis were influenced by this will to power philosophy. It's a distortion of Nietzsche, but they took it in a direction where it was collective will to power, and that led to fascism. And a lot of people are still concerned about fascism. That's because we really can't know human nature. We can't really know what the good life is. We need to will to power. So we're not focused on reason anymore. We're focused on the will as what drives human nature, and the will in the service to the feelings. Okay, so let's talk about postmodern, and we can, argue about dates, but I picked 1900 because that's the year that Nietzsche dies. And I think we're still in this era. I don't know when it will end. It's not my favorite. It's definitely fun for thinking, but I don't know about doing ethics. All right, so William James is going to be part of an American tradition in philosophy called Pragmatism. And so I have him way over here. I've actually written about all of this in a book I wrote called Retrieving Knowledge, a Socratic Response to Skepticism. And you can read about how all of these empiricist philosophers are sharing a family resemblance of assumptions. Part of it is that they're all empiricists, they're all naturalists, they don't do metaphysics, but they do want to live in the world and act in the world and maybe gain more power in the world and do practical things. So Dewey thinks that truth is what works. Now, that also comes into ethics. Ethics is what works. But we're going to see there's a problem with that. Works for what goal? We still have to have a goal. And it may be the goal of the fulfillment of desire. It may be the goal of gaining more power. But we can't bypass goals in ethics. But James is a pragmatist. John Dewey is also a pragmatist. And he's famous for extending his pragmatism to the field of education and experiential learning. So college is not about lectures and book learning. It's about experiencing, it's about experimenting and learning through that. So that's how the empirical method of knowing things gets worked out in the educational sphere in the academy. Now, Sartre, he is in that French continental tradition. These are American pragmatists. He's in the French continental tradition, and he is seeing a lot of he's not the only existentialist, but I put him here because he's important. The existentialists see the death of God as bringing nihilism into the world, meaninglessness, and they accept the claim that there is no meaning and we have to will our own nature and will our own meaning. So in a sense, Nietzsche and perhaps even Heidegger are the granddaddies of the existentialist movement. And I tell my students now that every college student is an existentialist. We can talk about that some more, but you have an existentialist phase in college. You got to make your own self, right? And you can see how some of these self-formation, self-identity is a making of yourself. John Rawls is in the, I would say, analytic tradition of philosophy in America. He is mostly focused on political theory. He is known for developing a kind of liberalism where it's a secular liberalism, and I don't mean like, it's political liberalism, classical liberalism, and he's known for that, but he's also in this category of pragmatist, empiricist, material monist, pragmatist. So you can see they all kind of share that empiricism, materialism in this category. Cornel West is an interesting character. I'm putting him here because he is maybe one of the figures who brings together all three traditions that we've been discussing. He is a current philosopher. You can look him up on YouTube and see what he's saying. He is in line with the pragmatist philosophers, but he very much understands the analytic tradition, and he very much understands the continental tradition, and he is sort of a critical theorist as well. So I put him here because he's a kind of a culmination of philosophy to our day. He also talks about God. He also does a bit of theology, so that's interesting, I think. So I put him in this category. He's still holding to this loosely empiricism, God exists, and he's a pragmatist when it comes to philosophy, but he's also collectivist, also a Marxist, so a very interesting character. He is also on a lot of YouTube shows, so you could look him up. Cornel West. I put Robert George here because Robert George is good friends with Cornel West. He comes from a different tradition, a different background. He's at Princeton now. He is very well known for his arguments about abortion. And he's probably still going to be in this empiricist tradition because he is informed by Thomas Aquinas. So he's a natural law theorist, and he's going to be part of a movement called New Natural Law. New Natural Law rejects metaphysics, or it says we don't have to do metaphysics in order to get human nature and moral law for humans. So I have studied his philosophy a bit, and I think he's maybe I don't know if he's as well known as some of the others on this list, but he's a contemporary philosopher that is very much on the scene. He's also on YouTube, and you can see Robert George and Cornel West having civil dialogues together because they come from different traditions and they are different, but they are able to talk across their differences and talk about racial things too, race relations. Peter Singer, I also am not sure how much he is deserving of being on this list, but I'm putting him here because he is also at Princeton. He is a colleague of Robert George, and he's completely different, completely, I would say, opposite, and especially on abortion. So Robert George and Peter Singer are at the same university, and they are opposites. And I think this is a beautiful thing, that students can be exposed to different views on abortion in the same college. And if they don't want to talk about different views, they don't have to take those classes. But Peter Singer is, again, an empiricist, a materialist, and he is developing utilitarian philosophy. And he says some controversial, crazy things. You can look him up on YouTube as well. So once we get into these modern guys, they all, have courses online and videos you could look up, and they're kind of being discussed right now. And then the last thing I put on our list is critical theory, just because it is very hot right now. And critical theory begins in the 1930s. It is a continental strain of philosophy. I argue that it is very much influenced by Nietzsche, insofar as it's in this category over here, the fourth category. It's empiricist, it's materialist, it's Marxist oftentimes, and it's where we get social justice as a movement. And I think we should talk about that in an ethics class. So this is the right now. Critical theory is critiquing the past, it's carrying on that tradition of deconstruction of the past, but it's also carrying on a reconstruction of values. So we can talk more about that. And I do have a whole series of videos I'll be adding to on critical theory on my YouTube channel. All right, so here's some data that you could look into to see, is Burton right on her interpretation of history? Perhaps I'm not, but this is how I see it. And it's moving logically through several options, and we're currently in the fourth option. What comes after this, I don't know. There are historical eras, and they are moved along by philosophers putting forth their philosophy, interacting with others, and there's a challenge and response relationship. So Thales puts forth his ideas, some people find problems with it, put forth an alternative, and then that's how this history moves along. And we're playing with logical options. So it's the history of ideas. It's not a social history, it's an intellectual history that I'm looking at. And you can go and find another timeline. There are many online. You can see who else is in this history in between here, and where would they fall on this timeline. So this is something you can verify empirically. And you can also go and see, do we want to tighten up some of these categories? I think I do, but loosely for the ethics class, I think I've gotten it close enough that we can see a pattern, we can see some movement in history, and we can see that these philosophers are conversing with ideas that have come before. So this is part of what is called the Great Conversation in the West. Some people want to decolonize the West, which means get rid of all these old, dead white guys. I think that's a social reading of history, a social scientific reading of history. If you look at an intellectual reading of history, they're having a conversation. And we, being in this postmodern era and this social justice moment, are inheritors of that conversation. And if we were to get rid of that conversation, we wouldn't understand how we got here. So we can't cancel philosophers. We can bring in other ideas. Maybe there's a whole host of ideas we aren't looking at. And if you want to say decolonizing the curriculum means bringing in alternative voices, I say bring them in if they've got better ideas. But don't bring them in just because of like misrepresentation of classes of people, or non-representation, or low representation. This is about ideas, not about identity. Okay, so that conversation is going on right now about identity politics. I would say that identity politics is a category for ethics, and it comes in this last phase, critical theory. We should definitely discuss it, but in the name of social justice, we can't reject all that has gone before. If you disagree with me, that's fine. Let's talk about it. But if we're talking about it, we're still in that tradition. Notice also that this end phase, the social justice moment, this moment we're in right now where politics is king, everything is politicized, we're not really operating out of reason. We're not really capable of arguing well with one another. The public discourse is more emotions based, and that's because once you get into these second two columns, reason isn't applying to things we can talk about in the world, and reason isn't grounded in human nature, which is what these first two columns would say. So we have a different view of human nature than previously, and we have a different way of interacting together in this last phase of things on my column. Now, if I had it my way, I'd return to reason is ontological, and I'd say let's argue about whether God exists or not, because I think that we didn't do that well in the past, and we could do that better, but we'd have to return to reason is ontological first. Reason applies to being, and human beings are rational beings. There is a logos in humans, and there is a logos in the world. And then we'd have to ground that logos in some being. And I would say that's what Christians did the best. That's what John did the best. He grounded, the Apostle John, he grounded reason in the being of God. And that's what makes things knowable. So, I say, let's reimagine reason, rethink reason, and do better ethics. So when I need to transition to the thing we're going to do next. After this, we're going to talk about these major secular ethical theories, and we'll look at some non-secular ethical theories too. And now you'll understand why there are so many, why they disagree with one another. And remember, ethics is trying to find rational justification to the answer to the question, what is the good? And it's going to be based on human nature. So we have now various views of metaphysics and various views of human nature. So we have various views of the good life. Okay, I'm going to pause here. This has been a really fun discussion. I hope it got you thinking, and I hope it will help you to make sense of the ethical theories we're going to look at next. Thank you for sticking with me.